This symposium is really a highlight of our academic year, and it's been made possible by a generous gift from John Seely Brown. JSB has a long history of involvement with the School of Information, and by enabling events like this one, his support helps make us the #1 School of Information in the world, a school with unparalleled breadth and excellence in both the study and design of information technology that empowers individuals, communities, and large-scale societies. JSB is here with us this afternoon, and he'll be participating in the panel that follows our keynote lecture. As you all know, JSB is a seminal thinker in the information field, and I'm delighted to announce that he has recently received yet another major honor. Just on Monday, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As always, it's a pleasure to recognize JSB publicly for underwriting the costs of this symposium, and we thank him profoundly for his ongoing support of the school and its mission. JSB, can you stand up? Since its inception, the purpose of the John Seely Brown Symposium has been to bring thought leaders in the information field to campus to discuss the implications of technological advancements for society. Over the past several years, we've been honored to present a variety of internationally known scholars who have shaped their insights on everything from the expanding concept of literacy to the impact of the digital revolution on modern libraries. Our speaker today will continue the conversation with a focus on how young people are affecting and being affected by social media. I'd also really like to thank the Ross School of Business for hosting us today and allowing us the use of this beautiful room. Before we get started, I'd like to invite Jeff Mackey Mason, SI's Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, to the podium for a special announcement.
So many of you surely know that it's common to give an honorarium when you have a distinguished speaker. If you don't speak Latin, that's cash. Less common is to do what Danah Boyd has done. Danah asked us to turn her honorarium into a scholarship for a promising student specializing in the area of social media or youth and technology. So I have the very pleasant assignment of announcing that Danah Boyd's contribution will go to Emily Rosengren. Emily? Emily is one of our first undergraduate informatics concentration students. She's a junior and is specializing in the social computing track of the informatics degree. She's a member of the LS&A Honors Program. She's a peer advisor in the Michigan Community Scholars Program, which is a living learning community focused on community service and social justice. She also works as one of the coordinators of the University Community Film Series hosted by the Ann Arbor District Library. Emily was first introduced to informatics in SI 110, one of our gateway courses, in her sophomore year, and soon after declared her concentration in informatics. She now works with Professor Paul Resnick on a social media research project. For what she's already accomplished, for what she's destined to do, it's my pleasure to award the Danah Boyd Scholarship to Emily Rosengren.
Thank you. Our keynote speaker today is Danah Boyd, a social media researcher at Microsoft Research New England, a fellow at the Beckman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School, and for those of you who don't know, a very prolific blogger. At the Berkman Center, she conducted the Internet Safety Task Force to identify potential solutions to keep children safe online. She spent 5 years with V-Day, an organization working to end violence against girls and women worldwide. She recently completed her PhD at the second best School of Information, the University of California at Berkeley. Her dissertation, which was funded by the MacArthur Foundation, investigated how American teenagers socialize in networked spaces like MySpace, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Her corporate work includes time at Google, Yahoo, TribeNet, and Intel, and she currently advises and consults with several other companies. She describes herself as an activist and a scholar, and she's here before us today in both capacities. I know we are in for a stimulating and thought-provoking hour. Before I present her to you, we have something to present to her, since we've already given away her honorarium. This is a commemorative tile commissioned by the School of Information by our own local Matawi Tile Works. The text reads, "People, Technology, and Information, the three interlocking principles of our field." They're represented in the center by a graphic design of the Borromean rings, and if you don't know what those are, Dan Atkins is here and he will explain them to you. But it's a symbol that we really identify here with at SI. I hope you'll enjoy this as a souvenir of your visit, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Please welcome me in joining Danah.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. So today I want to talk to you about the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years about how young people are using social media in different ways. For those who aren't familiar with my work, what I am fundamentally is an ethnographer. And what that means is that I spend a lot of time trying to get a sense of how young people are living their lives and how technology tries to fit into it. And mostly for the work that I'm going to be talking about today focuses on work I've been doing in the United States, primarily over the last 5 years. Different field work, different kinds of projects that I've been looking at, mostly funded by the MacArthur Foundation. The work that I'm going to be doing today looks methodologically at these field sites. These are the different places that I spent a lot of time in, which unfortunately involves a lot of flying and a lot of driving. But it was actually a really fun adventure to spend time across this country, seeing different perspectives about how young people use technology. In addition to the in-person work that I did, I also analyzed 10,000 MySpace profiles, the content of which, to look at seeing how young people were actually using it, what the traces of the technology were. I also spent a lot of time looking at blogs and doing a lot more informal conversations. That's sort of the requisite methodology slide for those who are more academically minded. I'm happy to talk in more detail about what I did. What I want to focus today is actually specifically on social network sites and the way in which young people have used this as part of their engagement more broadly. Social network sites exist in many incarnations around the world. How many of you are on Facebook or MySpace or something like this? Actually, how many of you are not on one of these sites in any form whatsoever? Okay. So I'm going to give you a way of actually thinking about what constitutes a social network site. This is primarily for people who are actually experienced with them, but also for those who aren't familiar, it can make sense of it. There are 4 key features that help us understand the core of a social network site. And the first of which is the profile. When you woke up this morning, you conveniently had a body that was kind of attached to you. It's very, very useful, right? And you woke up and maybe you showered, don't tell us if you didn't, and you decided to dress yourself. And you decided to dress yourself in ways that you thought might be appropriate for what you were going to do that day, right? The appropriate clothes, the way in which you were going to dress your hair or not dress your hair, putting on shoes that took into account the weather, which is beautiful, by the way, and trying to present yourself in this environment with what you think is appropriate. When you go online, by default, you're an IP address. And for most people, an IP address isn't really meaningful, the geeks in the room aside. So what happens is you actually have to spend some time figuring out how to express yourself online. Who are you? How do you write yourself into being? And so the profile is, in many ways, the digital body, the way in which you write yourself into being online. But you don't do this completely in a void. You do this with an understanding of who the world around you is, what the context is. So audience and context matter. And what you see with profiles like this, especially with teenagers, is that they're speaking very much to their friends. A social network site, you'll hear me say that instead of social networking sites. And the reason why is because what makes these unique has to do with the social network and the pre-existing social relations, not the ability to actually network and meet new people. So when you're doing that, you work within the technological constraints to say, here's who I am. I can guarantee you she is not 95, and she is not from Christmas Island. I was delighted to find out that Christmas Island does exist. It's a very small island of a population of 1,500, but she's not from there. How do I know? Well, if you look at what high school she goes to, when she lists it, it's in New Jersey. All of her friends, also from New Jersey. And in fact, on the day that she turned 16, everybody said happy birthday to her, right? Probably not saying happy birthday for her 95th year. So why is she putting up this misinformation? What we find in these profiles is that it's about what matters within the social system. She has made a decision, as many young people have done, to lie about their age and their location because it's assumed to be the way to be safe. But at the same time, to really express herself in her friends in the way that matters to her. Interestingly, teenagers rarely lie about their birth day, they just lie about their birth year. Why? Because the system actually notifies on birthdays, and you don't want to get a happy birthday on the wrong day. So we get these ways in which they're working within the particular technology to use it to express themselves. MySpace was a really interesting incarnation of it because for all of those who are horrified by the blink tag incarnation of the really flashy MySpace profiles, it was not built into the system. In fact, it was actually a mistake by the creators. MySpace was actually built in Cold Fusion for the geeks in the room. And the way that they actually dealt with the forms is they didn't actually account for all of the content in them. So when people put in JavaScript and HTML, CSS code, they were able to modify the profiles. This created an entire culture of copy-paste literacy, where the goal was actually to make sense of the profiles and to use the technology to make them their own. It was a very interesting creative moment at the time. At this point, Facebook is a very different type of platform where the technology creators think that they're smarter than their users and are not actually as willing to work within what the users wanted to do. So one of the ways in thinking about this in terms of young people is in the same form as bedroom culture or locker room culture. And the idea that you can actually express yourself using all sorts of multimedia to say who you are, what you like. A lot of the profiles have all sorts of taste signifiers on there as a way of expressing themselves to their peer group to say what matters to them and to really locate themselves. I had a very fascinating interview with one girl, and I was asking her, about why she liked to decorate her MySpace, and she said to me, well, my mom's a decorator, so she doesn't let me decorate my bedroom. So guess what? My MySpace is my substitute for my bedroom. And I thought it was a really interesting way of marking it. And we see this kind of substitution, the same way of taking those images and ripping them out from magazines and putting on the bedroom, we now see online. So the first thing is we have that profile. The second thing we have is the public articulation of friends. And anybody who's been on these sites knows for granted that friends are not the same as friends, right? So who you connect with online are not your closest and dearest, the people that you're intimately attached to. There's a whole variety of reasons as to why you've said yes to somebody as your friend, right? Either because you don't want to actually deal with the social repercussions of saying no, or you might want to have a reason to talk to them, or you did actually go to high school with them way back in the day and you feel guilty that you have to actually connect. Same rules apply for teenagers. And what we find is that teenagers consistently put all of the people that they know, all of the people that they interact with on a regular social basis, with a couple exceptions, namely their parents. Having people who hold power over you is often an exception to this rule. But these public articulation of friends often involve multiple hundreds of people. They also include people that just may be seen as cool, right? A particular celebrity or somebody who's highly visible that you want to connect there. The way of conceptually thinking about the public articulation of friends is through the frame of audience. That this is actually writing the audience into being, right? Having a sense of who you're going to speak to, and this is a way of publicly articulating who that is and keeping it as a reminder of who that is. So one of the things I say to parents all the time is that if your kids have not accepted you or anybody else your age onto the site, don't worry. It just means that they're actually engaging with their friends at large. Now, this public articulation of friends is very different than the kinds of ways in which we interact with every day, with a couple exceptions. I don't know how many of you remember the broken hearts from middle school, or the various friendship bracelets, which were these formal articulations of relationships. But under normal conditions, we don't really publicly articulate our connections, and therefore all sorts of drama gets induced. And what I see from teens, especially with the MySpace Top 8, MySpace Top 8 took it to an extreme where they said not only did you have to list your friends, but you had to list your best and bestest friends in order. And I've been really enjoying adults getting onto these sites because they realize how absolutely difficult this is. And so what you see is that teenagers complain, and it becomes a way of brokering status within those particular schools. All right. Third key feature. This is the testimonials, the comments, the wall. And if you actually look at a teenager's profile, most of the content in these profiles boils down to, yo, what's up? Not much. How are you? Good. What you doing? Nothing. Back and forth and back and forth. And a lot of adults sort of pull their hair out and they're like, why are they spending so much time saying absolutely nothing? And what they're actually doing is a form of social grooming. They're reaching out and being like, I like you too, that's good, and back and forth and back and forth. I dare each and every one of you to pay attention to the conversations that happen in the hallways, and I would argue that most of them have about this same level of depth, right? How's the weather? It's gorgeous. What you up to? Nothing, right? And back and forth and back and forth. We do a lot of work on a daily basis to just keep ties maintained, a way of acknowledging one another in a show of appreciation. And we go through a whole set of ritualized engagements doing this. Not surprisingly, young people are also doing this online. This has become part of their social hangout and a way of acknowledging and recognizing one another. And so this form of social grooming that happens means that the content doesn't have sort of depth. I'm interested to see how adults have actually adopted to this. And by and large, adults don't use the wall as it was originally created, except to say happy birthday. So in some ways, happy birthday has become the substitute of social grooming, where you only have to do it once a year. So the fourth key component of this is status updates, microblogging, mood updates, depending on the system. And this is actually a way in which you sort of publicly state what's going on in your life, what you've had for breakfast, and you let everybody else know. Now, people are saying, again, why do I need to know about somebody's breakfast? I personally like to know what my mother is having for breakfast, because it lets me slowly see her rituals. And this is actually why this occurs. This occurs as a way of being peripherally aware of what is going on around us. That slow level of making sense of the world and seeing its patterns. Not because I need to actually remember the details of what my mother had for breakfast, but because I want to see that she's actually eating and that she's part of this update ritual. And it's a nice way of keeping in touch and keeping aware of one another as part of a social environment, even when it's not actually about the details of it. It is also one of the ways in which we broker attention, right? Because it becomes this game of who are you paying attention to and what details of it. Do you actually have awareness of what's going on with the people around you, and who are you paying attention to? This has reached, with adult populations, a whole new level through the power of Twitter, where we actually compete to have the most succinct and depth that we could possibly manage in 140 characters, right? Which is not a lot. And Twitter has become an interesting competition in the adult space for this. Now, I've been following teenagers as they've hit Twitter, and it's that's one of my fascinating marks. And there are teenagers on Twitter. Statistically speaking, teenagers are not adopting it en masse, but the teens who are adopting it are absolutely interesting. And what they're doing is primarily very, very social. They're interacting with people in a way that looks a lot like a traditional online community, where it's not necessarily people that are engaged because they're co-located, but actually much more engaged with people around communities of interests. And the number one reason that this is happening is celebrity participation on there. And yes, I know Miley Cyrus has quit. I built this deck before Miley Cyrus has quit. And the celebrity participation has actually been absolutely intriguing to watch, because these celebrities come and give you a sense that you have access to their lives, and this is it takes the tabloid culture to a whole new level. So young people who are following celebrities feel as though they can actually build these relationships, and we think a lot of this celebrity engagement in terms of parasocial relations, the ability to sort of follow, but what Twitter does is the possibility of getting reciprocity in all of this. And so teenagers will actually sit and, hours after hours reply different celebrities in the hopes of just sometime getting a response, and every once in a while they do. And it's unbelievable to watch the hubbub for them and the people that follow them when there is a response. So this has become a subpopulation, and one that I'm not going to go into detail today, but one of the things I've been tracking going on. All right, so how do we think about this American teen engagement? We can think about that in terms of the structural forms, but part of it has to do with what the social forms are. And often when I spend time in teenage environments, and these change over time, is that if I'm not on MySpace, I don't exist. Everyone says you have to get a Facebook, and it becomes a social necessity to participate. Right? And failure to participate means that you're written out of all of the social environments. For me, growing up, this was the mall, and I spent hours begging my mother, right, please let me go to the mall, because the mall wasn't so much about, necessarily interacting, with a specific individual, but collectively to know what was going on. It was a way of being a social participant in the community at large. Note, my mother did not let me go to the mall, so I spent a lot of time being very frustrated with her about this. And the same sort of battles have been playing out in terms of social network sites. But participation is where you keep up with the Joneses. It's where you keep up with what's going on in the entire environment around you, and that's where it becomes part of this social environment. And a lot of adults who originally were looking at what was going on with the social network sites were like, oh, this is because they're almost always interacting with strangers, and this is this terrible place. Why would they possibly go there? And the reason that you hear over and over again is that they're just there to hang out. And what they do when they hang out is the things that teenagers have always done when they hang out. They flirt, they gossip, they joke around, they tease one another, they actually share homework assignments and talk about things that we normally think about as educational. But they also just keep up with one another, form of gossip in the sort of lightest and most positive way. And again, the response is, well, why don't they do it in person, right? Why can't they get together in person? And what I hear, or what I hope will come up, what I hear is stuff like this. My mom doesn't let me out of the house very often, right? So all I do is sit on MySpace. And I heard this kind of statement in so many different parts of the United States that I started to really get concerned about the state of American teenagers. And I found that this was true for a whole variety of different reasons, some of which I want to highlight, because it's actually quite worrisome to think about about mobility in spaces. The first has to do with different kinds of fear, right? There's an absolute belief that if I leave the home, I'm going to get kidnapped. Why is this particularly interesting? Jordan actually lives in a very wealthy, gated community in Austin, where there's absolutely no sign that there's ever been anything dangerous to ever happen in this community. And I was really fascinated. When I visited this community, it was a beautiful spring Saturday. And I drove around the community looking for people. And I saw only one father and child out on the streets at all. Like, not streets, lawns, yards, right? These are all cul-de-sacs. And over again in these wealthier communities, what I hear is this constant state of fear. And this fear that you can't possibly leave, you can't possibly bike around. And that fear has become extremely pervasive, whether because there's actually a sort of cultural root and history of it, as in Jordan's case and her family, or whether there's just an abstracted notion of it. Fear has become so pervasive in the United States that there's all sorts of markings about the reduction of how far kids can actually roam. And so this was one thing that kept coming back as to why kids were not allowed out. When kids were allowed out, one of the complaints I heard is that nobody lives close to me. Busing systems in the United States have resulted in mixing up kids from different communities, but the result of which is that a lot of the teens I would meet didn't know anybody that lived in walking, let alone biking distance from them, and they couldn't actually find anybody that was close to them. The result of which is they were highly dependent on their parents and the ability to be driven places, and this was a burden in a whole different way. So teenagers felt as though they had no freedom, so they were very much locked down at home because there was no way to get out. I also started seeing a lot of cultural reasons, different things such as, specifically with immigrant families, concerns that parents weren't allowing kids to go anywhere because this was not the norm and they were here to do homework. They were not supposed to socialize. Socializing had absolutely no value, and the whole key was to actually stay at home and focus. This was actually the most pervasive in environments where you had multicultural environments and parents who didn't want kids to interact with kids from other backgrounds. In the wealthiest and most upper-class environments, as well as increasingly in middle-class environments, I kept hearing about overstructuring. Right? Kids who would go from morning to night in activity to activity to activity with absolutely no free time to just do as they pleased. And this became a really interesting struggle, and it has a fascinating root to it. In the 1980s, there was a bunch of data that came out that said, that correlated teenagers' success rates with their amount of structured time and their amount of freedom. And the assumption was causality, right? If they had more structured time, they would be able to do more homework, they would be more focused. It was the big argument against latchkey kids, right? This is actually where this played out. Well, it's not clear that that data is actually causal so much as environmental, right? The same conditions that result in kids being over-organized, usually wealthier families, hyper-involved parents, result in higher performance, et cetera. But the result of which is that in middle and upper class environments, it's become the absolute norm to structure every minute of a kid's life. And what I find from teenagers is that they then find any interstitial opportunity to interact socially. That they feel very frustrated that they don't have informal time. This is particularly dominant in places where kids don't even walk to school, where they're dropped off at home, or dropped off at school and then picked up at school to go home. And the failure to actually have just that lightweight time of walking to school with friends and walking home from school for really lightweight conversations. So again, we see this pressure put on into the digital world. So this actually doubles up when you say, oh, well, if I have free time, my friends don't necessarily have free time, and therefore this gets to a point of frustration. So when you ask teenagers, would you rather hang out in person or would you rather hang out online? There's a consistent story. I would much rather hang out in person. I would much rather get together with my friends. But then they list off all of the reasons why they can't. In some ways, as adults, we kind of know this, right? We spend that time thinking about our own friends, right? I want to get together with my friends, but there's this and there's that reason as to why this is not possible. And so online ends up not being a separate thing that we are addicted to, but this environment that ends up serving as a substitute for a lot of physical environment and physical connections because of the different structural reasons. Now, these environments, there's also another complaint about these environments, that they're extremely public. But I get an interesting story when I talk to teenagers about what it means to be public. And this is actually from a youth radio interview, and I think it's a really delightful response. My mom always uses the excuse about the internet being public when she defends herself. It's not like I do anything to be ashamed of, but a girl needs her privacy. So I started drilling down on what privacy meant and what it meant to be in public. And what I found when I asked teenagers about their homes was that most teenagers did not see the home as a private place. For them, it was public. So why was it public? Well, my mom can walk into my room anytime and she can look through my stuff. My kid brother, he's always just barging in. If I'm lucky if I can get bathroom time alone. The internet, on the other hand, I have control over. Right? I have the ability to control who can see what. Now, of course, we can argue about what that control really looks like and who is actually in control. But that tension becomes really salient. The belief that you have control over spaces online in ways that you don't feel as though you have control or agency offline. And so teenagers often talk about privacy as being this element of control. So there's this assumption that teenagers actually don't care about privacy. I find that to be absolutely untrue. Teenagers consistently care about privacy, but there's a question about what privacy means and who they're trying to be private to and for. And yet, at the same time, there's also a tension because, the general sentiment is public by default, private when necessary. So teenagers will talk about putting things in public because it makes you look like you're really social. Put it out on the Facebook wall as a way of showing your engagement. But private when you actually want to say something that might be embarrassing or hurtful, unless you're getting into the realm of bullying. Now, that doesn't mean that the internet is free of all of the different kinds of constraints of the physical world. In fact, the same fears that are persistent in the physical world continue to plague the online world. And Sabrina here is really interesting. She's deeply invested in a lot of fan fiction. And by any sort of measure, she would be this person who would be engaging in fan fiction communities, talking to all sorts of different teens. But she's absolutely paranoid to do so because she's convinced that if she talks to anybody online in any reason, that they will come and kill her. And that becomes really frustrating. And the pervasive level of fear has just got increased throughout my work. Over and over again, I hear fear coming up as the reason why young people are not in different places online. All right. So let's provide a sort of theoretical or conceptual framework for thinking about this. One way I'd argue is through the lens of networked publics. So what are networked publics? Network publics are publics restructured by network technologies, right? And I mean this in everything from the Livingstone sense to the Habermasian sense, in terms of everything from the public sphere to the more cultural publics. They're the spaces constructed through network technologies and the kinds of publics that emerge from that. And they're also the imagined community that emerges as a result of the intersection between people, technology, and practice. And as a result, they have many of the same properties and serve many of the same purposes as publics. But there are some fundamentally different affordances because of the networked element of that. And as a result, new dynamics actually unfold. So I want to talk about some of these affordances and dynamics that emerge. The first is persistence. What you say online sticks around. This is really great for asynchronous conversations. This is not so great when the things that you wrote when you're 13 are still online. Right? And it becomes this interesting tension about what it means to actually have material out there and to build a story that is fundamentally persistent, where you actually get to see time evolve as the data sort of builds on one another. And we see a lot of persistent material, and we see a lot of teenagers struggling with what it means to deal with that persistence. And they're going to continue, just as you will continue, to build these large presences online, and it will slowly get built over and over again. Another key affordance has to do with replicability. You can copy and paste conversations from one place to another. This is one of the beauties of bits. This is how bits work. But what this means is that you can move things from one context to another, right? That private IM conversation all of a sudden can be copied and pasted to Facebook. That, that mail sent to you from your dean can all of a sudden be forwarded and copied and pasted into a much broader audience. And it's very difficult to control certain kinds of bits because of the ability to replicate them and move them along. This, mind you, is actually one of the ways in which bullying becomes part of the story in online environments. Because the challenge with the copy and paste is that you can't necessarily tell the difference between the original and the duplicate. And you can't tell necessarily whether or not it's been altered, right? And you have a difficulty of seeing what the baseline is. And so I can actually say something terrible about somebody, or you can say something very neutral about somebody, and it be copied and pasted to say something terrible. And I have to defend myself against this alteration when it actually looks like it's part of the original. And that's been part of the struggle in a lot of the forwarding material. Another key affordance has to do with searchability. My mother would have loved the ability to stand in the middle of a room and scream grep or find and figure out where I had run off to. She couldn't, for which I am deeply, deeply thankful, right? What happens today when people are searchable? And we all are experiencing this as adults, right? Because you're searchable in very specific contexts. You're most searchable by people who hold power over you, who are looking for you. Whether that is a parent, a boss, whether that's a college admissions officer or a potential employer. These people who are looking for information about you use the searchability. The beginning of any sort of dating interaction involves a lot of sort of stalking, right? Finding out as much detail as possible. And so this ability to search means that you can take information, again, out of that particular context, and you see it without understanding why it was put out there in the particular way. And searchability has been this interesting plague of a lot of online communities for a long time. I think back to the days of Usenet and what happened when Danah entered the space with Usenet. Usenet felt like it was pretty ephemeral and people were talking. And then all of a sudden there were records of it and Danah put it out. Not only did they put it out, they made it searchable. So you search for something like conversations about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you didn't realize that that was coming from a forum that assumed a lot of things about sort of Jewish culture or Jewish life, and all of a sudden you're seeing this out of context, and it created a whole new way of interacting with the material. Same is happening in these environments, and they become something that is part of everyday life in which people have to live with. The fourth affordance around it has to do with scalability. And it's the idea that things can scale to millions. That does not mean that they do scale to millions. And when I was advising with Technorati, I was really fascinated a few years ago to find that the average blog is read by 6 people. Right? Now, average. That means that Boing Boing and the like are really scaling the other side, meaning that there's a whole lot that are read by absolutely 0. Right? And so this assumption that you put up a blog and therefore it is read by millions ends up not actually holding. Right? That just because something can be viewed by millions does not mean that that many people are interested in it. And in fact, most things don't scale, as any politician or marketer has found out the hard way. That's what scales is inevitably that which is humiliating, embarrassing, grotesque, or sexual. Right? Which is not exactly what you would want to scale. And the poor kid with the lightsaber is still in therapy. What we find in terms of scalability is the struggle between what will actually spread and how do you actually seek attention, and how do you actually balance this as a teenager who wants a certain level of attention, sometimes by any means possible. And that's typically when we see scaling come up. So what are the dynamics that end up playing out as a result of this? These properties and related ones. The first has to do with invisible audiences. I have the ability to stand up here talking, and you are my audience in some sense, right? And you have been assigned the role of sitting there and pretending like you're paying attention, right? And even if you're falling asleep, not letting me know that, right? This is this game. And my goal is to watch you and try to respond to this, and to try to find a way in which I can react to you. But all around the room, there are these cameras, right? And I have no idea who's at the other end of them. I have no idea if the people at the other end speak English, if they understand what a school of information is, if they have even seen these sites, what time and place they come from, what their norms or expectations are. So the question is, how do I adjust what is an appropriate behavior? Right? How have I made a decision of what kind of jokes I can make, whether or not you will understand what grep is? Right? All of it is based on the assumptions of this particular space, the fact that we're in a particular environment with a technological bent. Right? I'm going to make a lot of assumptions about what you know because of this. And I'm going to engage with you with a set of norms because of my understanding of that audience. It becomes very tricky when you don't actually know who the audience is, or when you actually have to encounter possible audiences that you don't necessarily want to deal with. And that brings with us another key issue with it, which is collapsed contexts. Right? This audience has a particular set of contents, a specific set of norms. Well, what happens when you bring multiple contexts into being? And this has been a challenge that has been ongoing in different kinds of social media. Interestingly, in sort of traditional environments, we have a lot of social scripts for how to deal with environments where there's a collapsing of contents. And interestingly, we usually have a lot of alcohol involved as well. Right? The classic example of this is the wedding. Right? The wedding is an event where you bring together all sorts of people who you really aren't sure you want interacting. You script exactly where they're going to be seated, right? And you ply them with alcohol and hope you can make it through the night. Right? The online environment lacks alcohol. The online environment lacks the ability to do these formalized scripts, and so it often becomes very difficult to balance these different contexts. And what we see is often context failure. And the example that I like from this is actually from Joshua Meyerowitz's No Sense of Place. And he does this phenomenal job of talking about Stokely Carmichael, who was an old civil rights activist of the 1960s, who used to go around and give very different talks to very different audiences. He would go and speak before white politicos in DC using a very proper, posh, educated way of speaking. And then he would speak in Southern black congregations using a style of speaking that in that day and age absolutely terrified white society. In 1968, he was forced to go on television and radio, and he realized there was no neutral voice. There was no way to be simultaneously understood to all audiences. And he made a decision, and to this day, black power is seen as very anti-white. Well, teenagers are actually making the same set of decisions on a regular basis of how to balance different audiences that might actually see them. And often they struggle with it in really intense ways, or don't even realize the challenges in dealing with it. I got a phone call from a college admissions officer at a very prestigious university. And they had received an application from a young man living in South Central in LA. And he had written a long essay about the gangs in his community and how he wanted to escape them. And they went to his MySpace profile, and it was filled with gang symbols. And the college admissions officer read this and was like, he's lying to us. I was like, he's not lying to you. He's got to go to school every day in that community. And what survival means in that community is participating, or at least pretending to participate, in the gangs at some level. And that is baseline survival. And so all of a sudden we get this conflict, right, from an East Coast prestigious university not understanding the actual political consequences of specific decisions. And what he deals with trying to actually go through and be public in an environment that he's not entirely comfortable with, but wants to survive in. And we see these different struggles, especially for populations and participants who are dealing with really conflicted environments, places where there's a huge difference between the social norms. And many of us are lucky enough to be ourselves no matter where we go, but that's not true for everybody. And that's where we get another problem, which is the challenge of the blurring of public and private, and what it means to actually deal with these different environments and to deal with the ways in which you can control them. We assume that we can control them through space. We do it all the time. But what happens when the technology actually disrupts that? And disrupts the ability to actually make these segmented worlds. What happens when you're a teacher who is very good at being a teacher in all cases and has a public identity of being a teacher, but wants to use an online dating environment, right? And whose students find this and have a field day with it? How do you actually balance these different issues? Now, none of this is particularly new, and that's why I go back to Joshua Meyerowitz, who's doing an amazing job of marking what television and electronic media did to change this. But what we're seeing is a way in which it is playing out in everyday lives for teenagers, not just the people who actually get to be on TV or the specific privileged journalists or other type of audience, but the challenges of living every day in dealing with these environments, and that these kinds of network public features are affecting publics more broadly. Right? They're not simply saying, the network publics that I mark are not going to be here forever because publics are going to be infused with all those network practices. What it means is that the things that we take for granted about how they should work and how they should look get really twisted in new ways. And we see the opportunity, get to see the world from a slightly different angle. Right? The ability to suddenly see that trucks can be twisted upside down as art. And a way of thinking about technology as doing the same thing to our lives. How do they twist it and how do we address it becomes part of what goes on. I'm going to switch focus for a moment and talk about another section of my work, and this has to do with social stratification and what's going on. During the 2006 to 2000 school year, I noticed a shift in conversation. At the beginning of the 2006 year, the question on the table was always, are you on MySpace? And it was a yes or no question. This is, mind you, for teenagers in America. And then at the end of the 2006-2007 school year, the conversation was consistently, are you on MySpace or are you on Facebook? And it was a set of decisions. And I started trying to make sense of this. And at first we get to hear things, oh, well, it's particular features, right? There's particular features as to why I like one versus the other. And teenagers will talk about those features and what mattered to them or not. They will also talk about ease of use, and some technologies are more simple, more complex, and all this language thinking that the technology drove what they were doing. Again, some different sets of norms, right? So competition or safety, these came up all the time. Of course, fundamentally, the answer almost always came down to the choice had to do with where my friends were. If all my friends were on Facebook, I was on Facebook. If all my friends were on MySpace, I was on MySpace. Then I was watching this play out, and I was seeing all of these different explanations until I met Kat. And I met Kat, and she said to me, and this is part of a much longer interview with many different incarnations of this, I'm not really into racism, but I think MySpace now is more ghetto. I was like, that's interesting. I started driving down with her and saying, well, what is this? And she's like, well, it's where the rappers hang out. It's like, okay. And it's not where people like me go. She's like, okay. And I started to actually see that this language had a larger story, and I was like, ooh, ding, 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 ding. And I started looking back in my data and found that over and over again, this split that I was seeing had a lot, even in a single school, to do with socioeconomic status or to do with race. And I was like, So in the summer of 2007, I decided to write a blog essay on this. Recommendation number one to any grad student out there, make it very clear that this is an unfinished piece of work. The BBC mistakenly reported this as a formal report by Berkeley 4 hours later. Did not exactly go over well, since my essay was filled with all sorts of problems, including my own self-confusion and my inability to make sense of it. But the best part about writing this in public, and the best part about being in public for every step of my research, is that every time I would write something, precocious teenagers around the country would love to correct me. It was really, really helpful. But this was an interesting case, because when I wrote this essay about this division that I was noticing between Facebook and MySpace, adults around the country called me racist. Was probably one of the nicest things they called me. Many used much fouler language. But teenagers consistently responded to me with, yeah, that's exactly what's going on in my school. And they started pointing out that I wasn't pushing it far enough. Anastasia actually wrote to me, and she was really upset with the way I framed it. She wanted to point out that it had to do with movement. She said, my school is divided into the honors kids. I think that's self-explanatory. The good, not-so-honors kids, the wangstas, they pretend to be tough and black, but when you live in a suburb in Westchester, you can't claim much hood. The Latinos and Hispanics, they tend to band together even though they could always fit into other groups, and the emo kids whose lives are always filled with woe. We were all in MySpace with our own little social networks, but when Facebook opened its doors to high schoolers, guess who moved and guess who stayed behind? Right, and I think about that language, right? Guess who moved and guess who stayed behind? It was about this movement, and she was pointing out that what I was missing in this story was that it was about movement. The first two groups were the first to go, and then the wangstas split with half of them on Facebook and the rest on MySpace. I shifted with the rest of my school to Facebook, and it became the place where the honors kids got together and discussed how they were procrastinating over the next AP English essay. Okay? And she wasn't the only one to sort of push at this movement issue. Craig, across the country, explained the higher castes of high school moved to Facebook. The more cultured, the less cheesy. The lower class were content to stick to MySpace. Any high school student who has a Facebook will tell you that MySpace users are more likely to be barely educated and obnoxious. Like pizzas to be more cultured than Starbucks, and jazz is more cultured than bubblegum pop, and like Macs, you're more cultured than PCs. Facebook is a cooler caliber than MySpace. And this movement became really interesting to me because that movement is really particular. It's the idea that there is this new place and this place to go. And of course, it continues to come back up, right? Facebook is for old people, is the current attitude towards all of this. But at the same time, Facebook is more adultness. So I started trying to make sense of what is this split. And some of it has a lot to do with the history, right? We understand the history of this, right? For those who've missed it, MySpace started out in response to Friendster, and it targeted the 20 and 30-something crowd in an attempt to actually attract them to the site, and it did so very successfully. Many of the crowd that adopted the site were very much into music and were part of the urban scenes in major cities. Facebook, on the other hand, started at Harvard. Right? And it moved from Harvard to other Ivy Leagues. And it literally had a hierarchy of what it thought were the best schools as it's worked its way around them. In 2006, it opened up to high school networks, but it should be noted what kinds of high schools it originally opened up to. Phillips Exeter, Phillips Andover, Choate. Facebook, it continued to expand, and it wasn't until 2005 when they did that. It wasn't until September of 2006 when it opened up to everybody. Right? And so what this makes sense of, the ability to go where your friends are, of course, is natural. We go to where our friends are. But when our friends are on one versus the other, when our friends are in college, or when it means to, to be more adultness, to be able to make that movement or that transition, and that transition into college meant Facebook, that became the place to go. At the same time, the ability to be engaged in adult worlds for other groups of kids meant the ability to be part of the 20, 30-something social crowd, right? The people who were really into music and bands. And so friends were very much the determinant on this. But what we know in the United States is that everything about social relations is stratified. Right? It's stratified by a whole variety of factors involving race, involving socioeconomic status, involving lifestyle, involving location. And these things are reproduced online. And these things are reproduced online such that even when teenagers are choosing to use both, they're splitting themselves across it. And this actually has a long-standing history in teen culture. For those who aren't aware of Penny Eckert's work called Jocks and Burnouts, it's a phenomenal text. And she talks a lot about how even in any given school, there will be these splits. And of course, you can tell what year this was written, right? There would be splits between kids who were sort of jocks and burnouts in the schools. And that the vast majority of kids were either jocks or burnouts. But they were drawn to one or the other, and they were moving back and forth between both, trying to find who they were. The same thing ends up playing out here, right? This ability to sort of draw and pull back and forth and try to make sense of things, right? And figure out where the identity goes. But Penny pointed out that it's not just the fact that this is a split within the schools around identity, it's that that split is marked based on class. And that this topic of class, which we hate discussing in the United States, becomes extremely visible in the tensions around jocks and burnouts. It becomes really visible in the schoolyard. It becomes really visible in the lunchroom. And what we're seeing is that it also becomes really visible online. It becomes a place where you see this division within the environments online. And why does that matter? That matters because when universities do all of their recruiting on Facebook, who are they leaving out? When politicians think that Facebook is the place where the public sphere is, who are they leaving out? It should be noted that only this summer did Facebook actually surpass MySpace in terms of numbers in the United States. And yet, consistently, people think that MySpace is dead. The New York Times runs regular essays saying MySpace is dead, and everybody's like, yeah, I know nobody on MySpace. And then I go and spend time in field, and all these kids are on MySpace, right? Because they're not part of the story of the New York Times. And it becomes really difficult to see beyond our worlds because we assume that these technologies are part of it. So as we think about how teenagers are splitting themselves and we think about the way that these choices are playing out, there are major ramifications to what goes on, both in reflecting back to us our own social divisions and our own inability to deal with everything from racism to class in the United States, but the ways in which the technology makes visible the things that we find least comfortable to deal with. Switching focus one more time, let's talk about learning. And so one of the ways in which this technology gets used is people are like, this is the perfect thing to think about learning, right? We should bring all of these technologies into the classroom. And I'm always like, ooh, yes and no, right? There's a lot of politics to social network sites, right? The politics of saying yes or no with friends really matters. And you don't necessarily want that in a classroom. It becomes very difficult to deal with, right? So, but at the same time, there's a lot to be said about how technology can be employed. And let's be very clear. Learning isn't just maths and reading in a traditional way. There's a lot to be said about sociality and what goes on in terms of social learning. And one of the things I see is that adults are often like, there's nothing good to be had in terms of social interaction. I encourage you to pay attention to your professional or educational environment and what happens when people can interact socially well and what happens when they can't. Right? That group collaborations are dependent on sociality, that the ability to navigate campus politics is dependent on the social skills that you learned long ago. The ability to read people, the ability to read situations, the ability to adjust what you're saying and the behaviors that go on. So all of those things that I talked about up front, about why we actually create these profiles and how we navigate audiences, this is actually critical learning skills that we tend to think will just magically happen. They don't magically happen when we lock our kids in homes and tell them not to interact with other people. Social interaction actually takes time. You learn these skills. And it's not always pleasant to learn it, right? And one of the challenges of dealing with middle school and early high school is that there's a lot of bumps and bruises along the way. And so things like rumors are sort of a really interesting and nasty thing. And again, we like to pretend as adults that was just a teenage thing, but I'd say that they're pretty prevalent in the adult world as well. And rumors are a way of actually making sense of how things go and who actually will tell and who won't, how trust works. And one of the things I love watching teenagers is that they figure out through the process of rumors who to trust and who not to. They figure out that when they tell so-and-so this, that so-and-so will spread it to everybody. Right? And that process of working things out is the same skills that you need within your departments, within your communities at large, to figure out how you can make sense of office politics and collaborations and who you can trust and who you can work with. So one of the key things in terms of bringing this into the classroom is thinking about how do we actually teach sociality? How do we actually get people to constructively think through it? One of the ways in which we're doing it is sort of through the safety education and the bullying education, but we're doing an abysmal job of it. We typically just say no to technology instead of actually dealing with the underlying causes. Now, technology itself is being in the classroom over and over again, and it's being used in the classroom usually for very formal education reasons, right? But there's something to be said about bringing it beyond that. And I'm watching as innovative teachers are actually doing some of that, and they're using the technologies not specifically for what we would think about as educational purposes, but meta-educational purposes. And I really like this example. This is from a MySpace profile between a teacher and a student, right? And this student is complaining and saying, please tell me why pre-calculus is important to me. And she goes on to say, my mother didn't know any pre-calculus and she's doing fine, and I see no point to this. And the teacher responds, you're not learning this stuff because you need it every day as an adult. The reason is studying these things, pre-calculus, Shakespeare, whatever, is it helps you get good at learning how to learn. Right? And what we see in terms of a lot of social media is that it's actually not simply the platform in which formal learning happens, but where we see learning about learning. And we often, again, take this for granted. But one of the things I've seen in schools over and over again is that when teachers, like doctors, have no flex time to spend engaging with students beyond the formalized curriculum, they're not building the social glue that allows the learning to really proliferate. We need to figure out how to actually support not just the learning itself, but the infrastructure around learning that makes learning possible. And so what I'm seeing is the best uses of social media and best engagement between teachers, adults, mentors of all forms is to help the learning about learning, to help build the infrastructure to make learning possible, to build the support system that frees young people from, enables them to actually connect in terms of learning. Of course, the downside of this is that just like we talked about visibility, what happens when teachers start to engage in the flex time is that they actually also start to see where things go terribly wrong. And visibility is one of the biggest challenges of social media. It shows back to us not just racism, not just classism, but all of the things that we like to pretend went away. And one of the most salient within the schools has to do with bullying and harm. Right? The ability to see the way in which teasing and rumors and everything really affects the psychological well-being of young people. These are the things that if you were in the bathroom on a regular basis, you would see as kids hurt one another, but most of us don't spend our time in the bathrooms watching as teenagers interact with one another. So what happens when we start to see this online? And so I think there's this challenge of learning, again, about how do you support young people in this larger environment? Of course, beyond the particular social elements of it, there's a lot to be said about the information technologies that are coming into being. Right? The ways that social media is in some ways reconfiguring how we think about the flow of information. It gives us a way of actually accessing flows of information that are more specific to learning itself. We all know that it's reconfigured search, right? How we think about accessing information is fundamentally different. And young people at this point, I love actually showing them card catalogs because they're like, what is this? Right? Like, I don't understand. And you're like, oh boy. So search is one of the things we take for granted, the ability to ask questions of things. But just because we're using really advanced tools to do all sorts of information, all these sorts of social media tools, I would sort of highlight that young people are not using these tools. Young people do not know that tools like Delicious exist. They're not very sophisticated at what's going on. And even when they're sharing information, it's primarily through IM and through effectively digital word of mouth. They are engaging with other forms of media technologies, and it's important to note when and where that happens, one of which is Wikipedia. And one of the challenges in terms of Wikipedia is that this is one of the most elegant and beautiful open living systems of knowledge, where not only are you seeing the end result, which is usually what people argue about, but you see the entire history of how that page was created. Right? And the challenge with teenagers is that they figure this out usually by editing the page and writing, my name was here, right? And they figure out that they can edit it. But they don't have the support to actually figure out how to think about that editing process and how to think about the debates that go on around this. One of my interesting efforts has been to try to get teachers to think about teaching with Wikipedia instead of teaching against it. And one of the ways in which we can think about it is doing a deconstruction of how these edits were made. If anybody wants to see this, I encourage looking at the American Revolution entry. The American Revolution entry is beautiful. Why? Because, I guess I should back up and say a story. My mother is British. And as a young child in the United States, she came home with an American history textbook, which my grandfather immediately ripped up. Was absolutely horrified that this was how she was going to be taught a war that did not happen like this, that of course my grandfather did not live through, but had his own model of what this looked like, right? And what we see here is in the American Revolution, is that actually you have to resolve the two stories. You have to resolve the British history and you have to resolve the American history, and you get to see this unbelievable tension to reach some sort of neutral place. And so young people are using Wikipedia all the time, but again, with no sort of creative or sort of deep thinking about how this works. And this is actually where we have a ton of opportunities to do interesting new things. In the same way, many of them are producing their own content without a critical understanding of the remix or user-generated content that goes on, right? They're experiencing that blurring between consumption and production, but don't have a framework for actually making sense of it. And again, there's all these missed opportunities because we're seeing learning happening without a framework for thinking about learning. So for all the attention that's paid to the digital natives, a term that tends to drive me up the wall, it's important to realize and to put some of this in context, right? They're engaging with these technologies for all sorts of social purposes, but they're doing it very blind. They're feeling their way through it, and they don't have an infrastructure for actually thinking about it. So just because they understand the technology doesn't mean that they understand the information ecology, and in fact, they typically don't. What we as adults and as information specialists understand is actually the infrastructure itself. And we have this amazing ability to think about the scaffolding of it and how to actually organize it. But to get young people to engage with this is a whole new step. And so for those who are involved in learning and education, I think there's an interesting transition to be made between understanding the technology and understanding what it means to be social in the technology and thinking about how to apply it and really meaning for it in terms of information learning. All right, so I've mapped out some of these different issues, and I'm going to close this very quickly because we're going to move to the panel. But what I want you to keep in mind is that what has really changed with a lot of this technology has to do with visibility. And we have the ability to see all sorts of things, and what I find is that not much has changed that dramatically. But in some ways, we do a lot of forgetting. We forget what the world used to look like when we were teenagers, and we forget what it means to be able to see. What technology gives us is the ability to see, and it means that we see things that we don't always like. It means we see things that are in an environment that are very different than ours. We've spent a lot of time self-segregating, geographically trying to isolate ourselves from populations who are different than us, and the internet actually blurs that all together, allowing us to see all of these environments that we don't necessarily want to. So the challenge, especially for people who are against this technology, is to say, is it the technology you're against, or is it the things that you see that you don't want to that you're against? Because many of the kids that I look out and see in these environments are struggling pretty badly. And they're struggling pretty badly offline too, but nobody has noticed. Fundamentally, this is a public space, and a public space that is much larger and more connected in new ways than we've ever seen before. But it's actually showing all of the daily connections, the very local publics. And so we're seeing this unbelievable tension between a very local networked community and a much larger one. And teenagers themselves are primarily engaged with their local community, not with the larger one. They're not aware of it. And, you know, when I was talking to teenagers about some of their profiles, I met a group of Christian teenagers in the middle of Iowa, and they were talking about how they thought MySpace was a Christian site. And I was like, excuse me? And they were like, well, no, I mean, everybody puts up a Bible quote. You have to have a Bible quote there. I was like, oh, interesting. So I went to their profiles, and sure enough, Bible quotes on every single page. The hero was always Jesus. And I was like, that's interesting. In this small group, they were convinced that, that this world that they were living in was a world that was deeply religious. And they were at a conflict because they didn't see the world beyond them. And so just because these are public spaces, which they are, doesn't mean that you actually interact with people much broader than the people you actually care about on a daily basis. And so we get these beautiful tensions that come up. So when we think about these spaces, we have to think about them as publics, but we also have to think of them as a series of publics. It's just not one uniform public, but a series of them that are deeply connected. And that is the beauty of network publics. Thank you. I think I won the panel.
I've already mentioned John Seely Brown. He's the man who made today's program possible. He served as chief scientist at the Xerox Corporation and director of its Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, for nearly 2 decades. Today, he's a visiting scholar at the University of Southern California and independent co-chairman of the Deloitte Center for Edge Innovation, but he's generally known by his self-moniker, Chief of Confusion. He's the author of numerous scientific papers and books, the most recent of which is The Only Sustainable Edge, about new forms of collaborative innovation. Cliff Lampe received his PhD from the School of Information in 2006, and he's now assistant professor in the Department of Telecommunications, Information Studies, and Media at Michigan State University. As part of his research agenda, he studies sites such as Facebook and Slashdot, exploring the use of recommender systems and how users participate in sites over time. Ed Villametti is a blogging leader at AnnArbor.com. He writes FOIA Friday column, using archives and public records collected through the Freedom of Information Act to document and explore the workings of government. A graduate from the University of Michigan, he's a former program manager for SI's Community Information Corps. And Libby Hempel is a visiting scholar in the School of Public Affairs at Arizona State University. She earned her Master of Science in Information here in 2004, and in December she'll receive her PhD. She heads Research at Work, a company that uses academic research findings to inform the design of new social media tools and services. Paul Resnick will be our moderator today. Paul is professor in the School of Information and coordinator of the Social Computing Specialization. In his research, he applies principles from economics and social psychology to the design of online communities.
So I'm going to ask our panelists to take a few minutes each to respond. I may have a few questions for them, or Danah may have some responses, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience as well. Cliff's going to lead it off.
Do I push or just talk? Oh, I just talk. Awesome. Hey, everybody, I'm Cliff. I am at Michigan State. I study Facebook a lot. Danah and I have crossed paths many a time in the past and are good buddies in the research realm here. But I'm going to try to play the traditional academic role and throw wet leaves all over the burning fire of narrative she just told here. So let me offer a couple of alternative explanations for a lot of stuff. And Danah tells this wonderful narrative, and it's a very cohesive narrative about kind of hierarchy and power in these relationships and how some of that defines how people are using these social network sites, especially the youth that she studies. And I've studied youth in the rural context. We work in rural Michigan with a lot of people who use social network sites, and I've studied a lot of college students. We've done annual surveys of Michigan State students for the past 5 years about how they use Facebook. And you see a lot of differences between the college students and the youth. And I think there are a couple of alternative explanations for that. One is that there's generational differences, that the youth grew up using it differently, and they'll always use it differently than those groups of people who are in college currently. The other alternative explanation is that there is an evolution of use, that once you leave high school and move to college, you get normed by the people in college and then you start to use the site differently. My guess is it's actually the former explanation. I think that there's actually a generational response to social network sites that's very different, and that it might be that it's just punctuated equilibrium where it's now cemented because of the kind of explosion of them over the past couple of years, but it's still kind of hard to tell. Another alternative explanation is that the story that you tell doesn't really, it does in some ways, but the offline-online component is very important. So in our own work with the college students, we find that most of their Facebook friends are offline friends. And so the structure of how your online social network looks like is going to be really shaped by what your offline structure looks like, right? So in the rural youth, for instance, if the next nearest high school is an hour and a half away and you don't have many friends at these other high schools, the social network is going to look very different than where you might have many partners across many different schools. And then another explanation that I want to talk about more too is you gave this really persuasive talk about general affordances of these network sites, but I think there are also specific affordances that also help explain some of the variance in use. So we have a lot of evidence that a big shift in commitment to Facebook occurred between 2006 and 2007. And that was a big year for Facebook. They changed a lot of crap on the site that year, right? But a big one was the news feed. At the time, everybody really complained about the news feed being out there because it made it apparent how stalkery the site really was. But at the same time, the news feed became kind of a killer application for Facebook in terms of propelling use. The other big change was kind of the consistent UI of Facebook compared to MySpace. MySpace allowed for much more creative expression than what Facebook did, especially in terms of control of fields. Really, the only thing you could adapt in Facebook to some extent was your profile picture, which is a huge area of creativity, but then also what the About Me stuff, which it turns out is not important to almost anybody looking at Facebook, right? Nobody cares about those fields. So I think that's an alternative explanation as well, is what are the specific features of the site, not just general features of the network sites. And then I would also like to really agree with you on this story about kind of the role of these sites, especially Wikipedia and Facebook, in education. We've been studying collaboration in Facebook recently amongst college-age students, and they're all heavily, well, not all, they are heavily using Facebook to collaborate. That's another big story, is that people have different uses for these social network sites. And the ones who are doing it pretty creatively. And the students are using Facebook and MySpace and LinkedIn and a whole bunch of other media that they're on to collaborate with one another. Professors are almost entirely out of that situation, right? They are not using that, and they are basically being left aside in the educational process or the collaborative process in some ways. And my sense is, from what I know of the high school teachers I've worked with, it gets worse the further you work your way down in the educational systems. And most Facebook, for instance, is blocked in most high schools, right? Wikipedia is blocked in about half of them. And this is, I think, going to be seen as a dark age of using social network sites for educational purposes. That's me.
Thank you, Cliff. Libby Hemphill, you're up.
Yeah, so I brought a couple of notes so that hopefully I'll get to touch on a few things, but Cliff just reminded me of collaboration notes to take too. So I just finished my PhD here at SI, and I've studied information use in organizations and sort of information sharing in social media, usually with people who know each other. And my connections to Danah's work are that she studies teens who are usually interacting with people they already know also. A lot of times when we talk about social media and the press, it's about trying to get to know people you don't already know, and the two of us look more at people who interact with people they already know. Part of what's been frustrating as a person who tries to study social media is actually getting access to data. So if you're funded by the MacArthur Foundation, you can fly around the country and interview people, and you can participate in the kind of ethnographic work that I think allows us to have really rich, important understandings of what's going on. But if you don't have that kind of support, or you're not like hacker enough to scrape, it's hard to get access to the reams and multiple terabytes of data that are generated every day by the kinds of interactions that we just leave behind. And so my work is interested in sort of how do we get at that data, and what are the questions that we can ask when we look at huge amounts of social media interaction data. And it allows us to look at these sort of the movements from MySpace to Facebook and to explore the questions of social media ghettos through the traces that people leave behind, and to look, for instance, there's a big hashtag conversation happening on Twitter about this symposium. And when we look at social media from the conversation instead of from the person, it allows us to ask a different set of questions. And so I'm going to be interested to hear where you want to go next, because I know you've been doing some more sort of exploring what people are talking about and not just who they're talking to. And so I think that as we look forward about what we're going to be studying in social media, that we now have enough data to start looking at conversations rather than just, or starting from conversations rather than just starting from people. And this allows us to ask some of the questions that Cliff is raising about how do people collaborate and with whom do they do so. I'm finding that the social media tools that the people I study, so I study researchers and scientific researchers who collaborate with others around the country, and for them, social media means Skype. It's the thing that's most like what they used to do, but that is cheaper, rather than something really innovative like a hashtag. To them, a hashtag is a totally foreign concept, but we've been having a back channel conversation. And I brought my laptop because I wanted to know if it happened even after the panel started. So I am spying on you while you're talking about us. And the ability for us to be able to do these things where we're having conversations at so many different levels at so many different times is just fascinating. And Danah mentioned a couple of ways in which we explode context or we implode context. And these are the kinds of questions that I think will be interesting going forward. And I know she has more to say about them. But if you're interested in looking at huge amounts of data, it's getting easier to get access to that data, and allows us to ask questions and invite people to the conversation who weren't able to overcome the hurdles to getting access to data before. And I think in the next couple of years, as these data become more apparent and more accessible, that maybe the New York Times will stop telling us that MySpace is dead, and we'll be able to explore what the differences are, the impacts are of our own representations of what we think are happening, where the New York Times reporting the death of MySpace, or us watching Gossip Girl and thinking that all high schoolers use text constantly, that we'll be able to see whether there's a disconnect between what the data show us are happening and what we think we might be doing.
And for those of you who wanted to know what's the hashtag to be following, if you're finding the talk here less interesting than following it on Twitter, it's sharp Danah JSB. Ed?
I guess, though, one thing that I picked up that I want to expand upon is the observation you made about people moving from MySpace to Facebook. And I want to place that in a broader context of online migrations going back since basically as far as I've been able to find stuff. The first email mailing list that I was ever able to get access to was run by hand by a former coworker of mine, Einar Stefferud, and dated back to the 1970s. And you had, some small number of mailing lists back then was mostly what was visible from that. And as various parts of the organization, in this case the Department of Defense, found out about various email lists that were going on, they migrated as best they could to places where they had less oversight and intrusion. So the lists that were not appropriate use for various things, people moved to somewhere else where there wasn't quite as much regulation of content. The history of the 80s and 90s is littered with commercial services, CompuServe, Prodigy, Delphi, each of which sustained reasonably good-sized forums or other online communities. Here at the University of Michigan, there was the Michigan Terminal System, which had an online conference called Confer. So you have these various tribes or bands of, a couple hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And when the system that they were on eventually died a death of, the machine that it was running on was no longer sold or supported, those people moved from place to place. So the migration of people from online system to online system is a really old story and not a really new story. And what happens with that sometimes is you get these ties. If you're sort of looking at it strictly from the view of the system that you're looking at now, you might have no idea what what the backstory was for some of these conversations, because the relevant conversation that you would need to know was, 15 years ago, these people had a knockdown, drag-out fight on CompuServe, and now, therefore, they're not talking to each other. And you have these sort of really funny, undocumented, completely lost digital history of people where happily the online system that they were using in college got destroyed, so no one has to look at what they were doing back then. But that context is sort of still around for some of this stuff. And, I think as you think about how people move, for instance, the group of people that showed up on Twitter in my immediate circle, all sort of migrated there en masse from a mailing list that they had been on, Jerry's mailing list, a couple other lists that I was on. A friend of mine who was not watching Twitter this afternoon because he was tired of it, reading all of his friends being here, often refers to a group of his friends called the Nova Mob, who descend as a whole on a social system to take a look at it and test it out, because it's very hard to test social software without having a functioning society to test it in. So we tested probably 20 or 30 different online services over the past 2 or 3 years around a lunch group that I maintain. We tested a group recipe site to see how it behaved for socialization. We tested Delicious. We tested, anything, Walker Tracker for your pedometer tracking, anything where you could have people sign up and interact with each other within some context. And, I'm completely willing to believe that the evolution of Facebook and Twitter and MySpace and whatnot is going to be some other new system that has enough traction to get hundreds or thousands of people, not millions at the first bit, but to be able to sustain a group in some sort of group format, because a change in that world is more or less inevitable.
ASB?
Great talk, Danah. That's it. No. I want to pick up on a couple of things that were talked about here that you brought up, Danah. I want to reflect a moment on your blog experience at Berkeley, that you told that little story. And I'm really struck by a beautiful essay by Andrew Sullivan on why I blog. Mm-hmm. I used to say you can never talk somebody through a change of religion. And that, I think, is true. But we talk about conversations on one hand, I want to focus on practices, because there's a very subtle distinction between conversations on social networks and emerging practices. Well, both what happened to Andrew Sullivan and it happened to you, if I look at the way you use your blog some of the times, is you're engaging in a kind of provisional platform to lay out an idea that you care about, but you also are not so committed to it that I can feel free to attack it if I want. And it's a different kind of a platform for a different kind of critique. It is a friendly critique, not the kind of things that happen in the academy. It's not something that you're just bullshitting, because it basically is a provisional notion that you're putting yourself out there, you're exposing yourself, you're exposing an idea. It's not a casual. It's more than, and from that, you get very interesting feedback from which you actually advance. And, Andrew Sullivan in this beautiful essay, you can actually see how he went through radical transformations in his life from these provisional things that he was trying out and got fed back on, so on and so forth. Now let's move up from that in terms of, let's think about networks of imagination, very much like your imagined communities, that really come about by the whole notion of some of the networks you're talking about, but where you actually also have deep shared practices, or you're engaged in joint work. So if you study the World of Warcraft, as some of us do, in the guild structures, you will find after doing enough high-end raids that there's a phenomenon that happens in a distributed community that suddenly you feel like you have now entered into a true community of practice, where we used to claim communities of practice had to be done by small, local, face-to-face groups that were engaged in joint work. It is the issue of the joint work that gets to the kind of a joint practice that then helps to build the network of imagination. And so I keep wanting to come back to the notion of conversations versus practices. Now let's think about if you can have a distributed community of practice, which according to this game could scale almost arbitrarily, but still have some of the deep social properties and cognitive and tacit knowledge properties of a community of practice, scalable now, becomes really interesting in terms of, let's think about this in terms of learning, that we all want to talk about here and believe deeply in. You know, I find it interesting to see, you know, not only these study groups, which again, a good, effective study group has a shared practice. I mean, they work together long enough that suddenly tacit knowledge, not explicit knowledge, not conversational knowledge, starts to kind of emerge and start flowing in this distributed practice. These are very, very powerful. And one of the strangest things we have, and some of you know here from Toronto, there's a case now from the courts where basically this group of students at the University of Toronto, I think it was University of Toronto, were studying chemistry together, and the school decided to throw them out because they were cheating. And so in a very interesting way, you know, cheating under the old lenses is actually very effective knowledge production and a very interesting practice under what we're really talking about here. But I want to again distinguish between conversation and a practice, because conversations you can cheat, practice is pretty hard to cheat in. And so let me kind of end with a couple of other quick issues. You brought up the Wikipedia. You know, what I find so interesting about Wikipedia is people want to compare it to Britannica in the accuracy and ... And I keep thinking, you know, that's a category error, because the reading practices, as you pointed out, of Wikipedia are completely unrelated to the reading practices of Britannica. I mean, if you don't understand how to fold back the edit path and see what's still being contested, you don't know how to use Wikipedia. If you use Wikipedia under the old practices, then you're going to be screwed some of the time. And so it's a very interesting case that these new technologies lead to new practices. And we have to think about what some of these new practices really are. And, you know, let me end with an issue which a couple of us are beginning to explore more and more appropriately in the School of Business, not the School of Information, is the notion of how using these networks, such as Facebook, which I think is going to have a phenomenal business platform to it, possibly more than LinkedIn, is how do you shape serendipity? And this whole notion, we all know the power of serendipity, but do we know kind of how, what are the ways to kind of leave beacons around on Facebook that actually shape serendipitous events for you? And I think we're going to find that suddenly if you understand that, Facebook has become an amazingly generative problem-solving platform.
All right, I'm going to give Danah a chance to respond to any of the things that you want to, but don't feel like you have to remember it all, because I've been taking notes, and I'm going to step back through the panel and ask you to talk to each other about a few of the points that have come up. But I'll give you a chance first.
Sure. It goes in lots of different directions, so I will try to move in different ways. First, to Cliff, I think it's hysterical when Cliff tries to pick fights with me, because I don't think we disagree that much.
It's too hard.
A lot of it is when you're dealing with the teens, the offline and online are deeply entwined. I think the biggest question has to do with generation versus evolution of youth. And I actually think that I do actually side more with the evolution, because a lot of it has to do with life stage. And so it's not cleanly generation per se, but the life stage and where you're at, the different things that configure that life stage. And I think that tends to persist into adult environments. So adults from the same generation don't use the tools the same way if they're from different life stages or different sets of backgrounds. And I think that we actually have to mix that into a lot of it. I do think the specific affordances are very, very interesting, and they play a role in it, but I don't think that they are cleanly determining it. And that's where I don't think the technology determines the practices in all of these different ways. And I'm actually going to sort of jump to Ed from there for a specific reason, which has to do with, online movements. And I actually think there's a lot of reasons why the natural incarnation would think about the MySpace to Facebook as a natural movement. And I actually was of that camp at the beginning of how I was looking at it. But there were specific, it's really funny to try to condense many, many pages of things into 6 slides. But one of the things that I was really struck by was why teenagers stayed on one of these and why they differed even years after that movement seemed so natural. And more importantly, how it was narrated and who controlled the power of that. And here's where I think that the safety narrative is actually really, really interesting. And I decided to actually not do the safety talk today, but for 2.5 years, you couldn't open up a newspaper or turn on a television without being told that MySpace was a dangerous, dangerous place. And the language used around MySpace is actually the same as the language used around the ghetto. The idea that this is a place where people shouldn't go, right? And what that implicitly is a place where people who are white shouldn't go. It's a story of where, good kids don't belong there. And that language that was used over and over again very much shaped the movement, and who moved and who stayed behind. And one of the things, in that dialectic, and one of the things that I heard from teenagers who preferred MySpace over and over again is they're like, I don't understand why people keep talking about this as unsafe. There's nothing unsafe about it. And what it also meant was that those who enjoyed, who switched to Facebook, were critically unreflective about their own or what it means to be safe or unsafe. And we see a very different set of practices around the space that was narrated as safe. And that safety item to me is actually really critical as not just being a clean shift. It was also the fact that different kinds of teens switched or didn't switch that I think becomes really critical. And so I'm really still working on these. I'm working on a paper right now, really mapping through all of this data. So if you're curious about this set of arguments, I'd be happy to send you an early draft of that. In terms of access to data, I actually think you're totally right. I think it's really challenging to deal with what it means to get access to it. I've been greatly fortunate to have the ability to roam around in all sorts of different ways. And part of it is that I actually get very itchy. I can't possibly stay in one place for very long, so I feel the absolute need to talk to teenagers all around the country. It also is, part of it is a lifestyle thing. I had the fortune or misfortune of being single and have no children and be completely addicted to my work, which meant that I spent, for a couple of years, spent every Friday in an IHOP, every Friday evening in an IHOP, especially when sports games were happening, spent Sundays in churches in different parts of this country, and spent a lot of time just living and breathing it that I don't necessarily think is the way that people should live. I do think that we have unprecedented, I don't mean not participating in IHOP and this, but more the fact that working 24 hours a day does, it also reduces your ability to date. Funny that. One of the things I think we do have is unprecedented traces of data. And I think that that's where some really interesting methodological elements come up. Because just because we have traces doesn't mean that that data is the same as what we can get offline. And I think that there's a tension around it. I talk about these articulated social networks. Bernie Hogan from the Oxford Internet Institute and I have been sort of teasing out different kinds of networks because we're concerned that people tend to collapse what we mean by social networks. And so, for example, an articulated public network is not the same as the personal network that the sociologists study. So you cannot assume that these same theories apply. In the same way, a behavioral network, the ability to follow the traces of who texts who all day long, is not the same as an articulated public network, et cetera, et cetera. A good example of this is that, I love my mother, and I feel as though she's one of the most important people in my personal network. But based on any behavioral metric, you may not guess this, right? Especially if you were looking at digital behavioral networks, because she happens to be the only person I actually call on the telephone because it's the only way to reach her. So it's part of how you would never see her pop up in my email, and I don't live near her, so you don't see her popping up in that way. I've also done a pretty good job of keeping her away of certain social media, so I wouldn't see her as a friend. So you get these different tensions about who are different roles and how do we feel about this. But I think that when we look at this kind of data and we look at these traces of data, we have unprecedented opportunities of seeing a new lens, but I think we have to be really self-critical about what that lens is. So I think that there's, for those who have got a methodological bent in them, there's a really interesting opportunities to work out all of these different kinds of elements. JSB, speaking of methodology, My writing out loud as I've been thinking is something that people ask me how I learned to do this, and I sort of struggle with that because I don't remember not doing it. I started blogging in 1997. I started engaging in online communities in 1993. Right, I grew up with this technology. I grew up blogging. And I grew up blogging in many ways because of a very simple reason. My religious studies professor did not get tenure and had to move, and I decided I wanted to do an independent study with him from far away. And I didn't want to mail him essays. So I put them up online, daily reflections of what was going on. And all of a sudden, that became a thing, and I just kept doing it. And so I found myself blogging about my life. And when my life turned to be nothing but research, I ended up blogging about research. It's funny that. And so I never saw my blog as a professional publication, although people constantly do assume it is such. But it is indeed this place where I work out a lot of different things and get to connect with all sorts of different people. And I'm fundamentally part of those networks of people who are part of similar practices, practices of scholars and all of these different communities that have become really, really critical. And I live it and breathe it. My biggest challenge is that these tensions between the teenagers who they themselves are completely passionate about it and engage in it and run with the technology and see the potential and really do amazing things, and those for whom that's not even part of their story. And I see us having this, using Henry Jenkins' terms of participatory gap. I see that ever increasing in a lot of the communities in which I visit. And that's where I start to worry about how we actually deal with these people who just think of it as something that you do, and those who don't live in an environment where that even makes sense as a concept.
Danah, can I stop you and just back you up
Sure.
1 second here? In this provisional exposing of ideas, or as you said, writing out loud, do you see teenagers doing that? Is that one of the things that they're doing, is figuring out what they think by writing it down?
Some, but not as many as I would like. Most of what I read is very heavily social. Very deeply, deeply social. And to the degree that they're figuring out who they are, that becomes very, very important. But in terms of critically reflecting on the world around them, no. And that critical reflection is something that we learn for a whole variety of reasons, and that's ideally what school's supposed to teach, right? Critical reflection, a way of going about that, and what we find school does not teach, that's where I see this sort of tension be going on. There are kids who are doing amazing things. I think of one of the teenagers that I met during this process. A kid by the name of Sam Jackson. Now, Sam Jackson does not have the most unique name in the world. And yet, when you search his name, you will find that he comes up second to the actor. Sam Jackson started a blog when he was in high school, and he started blogging about the high school experience. And then he decided he wanted to blog about the college experience. And he's your classic precocious teenager. He actually started calling up admissions officers at Ivy League institutions and interviewing them about how the process worked and blogging about it, right, while in high school. And not only did he do this, he documented every letter that every college sent to him the whole way through applying to college. And he critically deconstructed each of those letters about what was probably being meant by the things that they were signaling. And he's brilliant. He played, he's now a junior at Yale, right? Who he successfully played the universities off one another to get to his school of choice. That's an amazing case study. I wish that kind of critical self-reflection was more normative, but unfortunately it's not. I think JSB and I both have had the fortune of seeing lots of kids like that who are amazing, but not mainstream.
But not a way of making it routine. Okay, let me just take you back to a couple of things. You and Ed both have talked about these migrations, and it seems like that's a phenomenon that's worth watching. You've talked about race and class as reasons for the migrations. Ed, I thought I heard you say that it was basically people were moving to where there wasn't as much regulation of content, not as many rules. But at least one thing that I've noticed is that people are going to stay ahead, to stay cool, to be the first one who's moved on to the new thing. And I wonder how much that's going to continue to be a phenomenon that's going to regulate the mobility. So that's for
I
both
guess
you.
the one comment I have is Google Wave. Google Wave. Yeah, not very many people. Okay, how many people want to be on Google Wave? More people. So to some extent, the demand for something that's always new is like, do I spend some time learning something new? Do I invest some time there? Do I learn it? Do I put some of my energy into this new system? Do I create a slightly new version of myself in this new, like, terra incognita or unknown blank slate space? It's the same reason that people start a new blog when they had new blogs, or it's the same reason people start a new profile when they have new profiles, a chance to start over. And in some sense, new systems are simply new chances to completely start over, either to build a new identity or to polish the one that you had, or to practice up on your German or your Korean or whatever.
And I think newness actually is twofold. One is this question of a matter of your personality and what it means. Like, do you like actually exploring the things that are new and being the front leader in all of this? Another has to do with what it means in terms of status. So Alice Marwick has been doing a lot of work on Web 2.0 technology workers and the markers of status in that community. And what she finds is really fascinating, right? It's not about what clothes you own. If you haven't met a lot of Web 2.0 geeks, you probably realize that. It's not about what clothes you own. It's not about, like, where you actually shop or traditional markers of conspicuous consumption. It's about who has access to the waves and the this and the invite party, just about being these kinds of access. We recognize these access markers as a form of status. It's interesting that technology has become cool in certain communities, that getting access to the new technology becomes critical. And Google gets that better than probably anybody else, which is why it limits its access to these technologies as it grows, because it creates desirability in certain populations. It's interesting to see with social media who it's about getting access to the new technology, or who just wants to go where all of their friends are. And we really see that tension constantly going back and forth, where people don't necessarily want to go to the new uncharted land if they don't know anybody that's there. They want to go to the place where all their friends are. They want the modern day Cheers bar, right? Where everybody knows your name and it feels like it's home. And so I think you get these two different movements around newness about who really is going to be pushing ahead for the faddish thing, and who is going to be just really happy when all of their friends are in the same room. I should note that technology companies do a disservice when they piss off the early adopters and the people who are really passionate about new. Nobody pissed off their users better than Friendster. Friendster basically played whack-a-mole with its most passionately engaged users, and kicking them off for anything that was remotely creative. And it did a really good job of basically creating MySpace and making MySpace the thing because it didn't kick off its users.
Dana, what is this Friendster you speak of?
Oh, I know. People forget it.
Cliff,
right.
you wanted to jump in on something on this.
Oh, I had actually a question. So do you think that story about adoption of social media is any different than kind of a typical diffusion of innovation story, where you have early adopters who are central to a network and everybody follows? I always follow Ed to see what he's doing and move after him, right? So I let him take the lead and follow. And that's been true of like cancer medication, of new types of tomatoes, of all sorts of things. Is there something different in this space, or is this that same Ev Rogers story?
It's similar, but I think you actually have to plug Rogers in with Sarah Thornton's Subcultural Capital to actually see the picture come out. And Subcultural Capital, playing along the economic and social and cultural capital, is talking about how anybody could get access to it, and this is ignoring things like Wave. Anybody could get access to it, but it's about being in the know. And she was specifically studying raves, and about how getting into the rave wasn't a hard thing. Knowing where the rave was a hard thing. Knowing what was cool. You think about a lot of music culture, and music culture is fundamentally about subcultural capital. And I think that a lot of what goes on about these technologies is about, when we look at some of this newness and the diffusion, is about it having this subcultural capital that it actually loses. It's one of the reasons early adopters do fade when it becomes mainstream, and that's where we see the other end of the spectrum. But I think that they're very interrelated.
It's about who you leave behind as well as where you're
Right.
going. I want to just pick up on one other thing before I open it to the audience, which is you said something very provocative about not everyone can be themselves no matter where they go.
Yeah.
It is painting integrity as a privilege. to be the same person everywhere you go is something that only some people get to do. And I wonder if that's, I wonder if there's more behind what you've thought about that,
Yeah.
and whether it's actually something that maybe it's different than that we're going to actually have to train everybody to be some combination of compartmentalized and not compartmentalized as these contexts merge.
It's interesting because I love geeks. I've spent my entire life being amongst geeks. But one of the constant stories you get in geek culture is accept me as who I am wherever I am and just get over it. And this comes at many different lenses, right? The wearing the jeans and the same OpenGL T-shirt for years on end, right? And just being like, this is fashionable. I should be allowed into the highest and nicest restaurant in San Francisco wearing exactly this. And it comes at this element of being socially inappropriate and being assumed to be smart enough or cool enough or high enough status economically in all different forms to be allowed to get away with it. Most of us don't have that world, and I shouldn't say that because at this point I have a ridiculous amount of privilege to be whoever I want and to be quirky and wear fuzzy things and be on stage as I please. Although right now I really wish I had one of my furry hats. Not everybody has that opportunity, and I say that at multiple levels, right? If you work for somebody, you have to pay a lot of attention to that boss and what the norms are in that work environment. And this is what we've traditionally talked about as social roles. And there are different social roles for different environments. And there's different ways of being in front of different groups of people. The teacher is sort of a canonical example of this. It gets us away from sort of more marginalized population. And we don't think of the teacher as a marginalized population. And yet the teacher is expected to behave in school in one set of ways where the teacher is a desexualized being. The teacher doesn't have a social life. The teacher does not drink or engage in anything that could be seen as what adults do because the teacher is there with specific roles. But yet when the teacher leaves the classroom, the teacher does have a life which often does involve sexual relations and alcohol or other such things that are not to be brought into the classroom. But what happens, you can't act the same way that you act when you are out with your friends at the pub drinking in the classroom. That is the quickest way to get fired, right? And the same is true for a lot of other people, depending on their position within society, of what it means to take on a specific role and how to be operating in different ways. Nowhere is this more visible than marginalized populations who have to act and behave in certain ways to attain some level of privilege and visibility. I study a lot of queer culture, and one of the things you see in queer communities is what it means to not be out and the need to not be out for certain environments, and what it means to be privileged enough to be out, right? To be able to demand acceptance, to be queer and demand acceptance in public, and that is a point of privilege. And so I think that we struggle often in dealing with all of these different environments of what does it mean to be out in whoever we are, whatever our identities are, wherever we go, and who amongst us gets to do that? There's nothing like the academy to be allowed to be as quirky as ever. Right? That's one of the promises of the academy, and that puts us in a very privileged environment compared to a lot of other people in the world.
Okay, I'm going to go to audience questions, and I'll start with one point that came up on the Twitter back channel, which is in response to Cliff saying, hey, students are collaborating online, but the profs don't get it and they don't go there and be part of it. Somebody posted saying, I tried that and the students thought I was stalking them. Is that the person who posted that want to own it and say anything more about that? Yeah, please. Was it you who posted that? If you posted it, feel free to follow up. Oh, sorry. No, I want to get Cliff's response to that, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, it's actually been an interesting change over years. So when I was first on Facebook in 2004, late 2004, early 2005, I was the odd Professor Duck, right, who was the only one they knew on Facebook. So students would friend me more often. And now students don't friend me hardly at all, ever, even though they all know I'm on Facebook. And so that's changed. Norms of these sites change over time, right? Yeah. And they don't see that we don't have that kind of relationship where I friend them and we interact that way, but there are lots of applications where you can interact. And at the very least, I can encourage, if you have a group project, create a Facebook group around this, or invite, and they will often do that, where they'll invite me to be a member of the group that they've created around a certain project, though at no point do we become actual Facebook friends, right? And that I think there are ways to balance those kinds of relationships through most of the social media.
Very good. Okay, now I'll open it to the question, and yes, please.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions, but I really appreciate if you did study with this. And one of the questions is that how can you explain in the dynamic field of the phenomenon from MySpace, more popular, and now to Facebook? If I can see, maybe it is explained this society as a whole, represented by the teenagers movement in a healthier direction, not getting more and more rapidly going downhill. And in the basic, this point of view is clearer to me. Because right now, from the society, if you develop further from basic need, food, shelter, sex, will no longer be the major challenge and issue. They move upper level to social esteem, and maybe even more towards global. Not yet now for the U.S. teenagers. But if I can say this is a phenomenon, if we can understand that, maybe it can at least help me to explain that teenagers, they are not narcissistic, not self-centered only, but instead they point up to the healthier direction. So make me feel, especially after listening to your lecturer as an expert in this respect, the society is healthier, although the economy sucks.
So, Danah, do you agree? Society's getting better because everyone's just choosing to go to Facebook?
I think that people are extremely, teenagers and adults are really rich in terms of their social interactions. There's no doubt about that. There's a lot of social engagement. I think that the number one trend that I am deeply worried about in terms of the health of society as a whole is the pervasive culture of fear. And I think that the pervasive culture of fear is really visible through this technology in unprecedented ways, where we are afraid of anybody that's not like us or not in these different environments. And so that to me is actually, that's the one sort of thing in terms of social that I'm not sure is going in the right direction at all. So just because people are interacting a lot more socially, they're also totally afraid of anybody outside of their world, and they're being conditioned to be told that strangers of all forms are dangerous, potential predators, et cetera, et cetera. So that trend, which, Barry Glasser did an amazing job of actually tracking a lot of this in the culture of fear. If you want to read a phenomenal sort of pop textbook, it's wonderful. And one of my favorite case studies that he uses in that, which has nothing to do with teenagers, has to do with senior citizens. He found that senior citizens, there was a mass media discussion about how senior citizens were being mugged on the streets. And some, dozen or so senior citizens were indeed mugged in this year span. But 4 or 5-fold that many died of starvation due to their fear of leaving the house to get food. Right? And so when we have this fear and when we use the technology for fear, which I am so not looking forward to H1N1 fear-mongering as we go forward into this year, and then what it means to be in a networked culture that can really push fear. Fear is a natural biological response, but I'm seeing that network technology being used in that negative direction. So I guess I see there's amazing opportunities and amazing social interactions, but I would mark fear as the thing that really worries me as going the wrong way.
So, Paul, I have a follow-up.
Please.
I, too, am worried about this sort of the culture of fear, and it's one of the things that I think that making the huge amounts of data that are available more visible might be a way to help us fight the culture of fear. That openness is an answer to fear it sometimes can be an answer, that if we can more accurately display what's happening and that we can expose the two different findings, like your example about elderly people, and that by making that data available and accessible and open and visible, that we might be able to combat fear, that sometimes information and access helps us. And it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if it's going to work, but I think it's something worth trying.
I mean, I think that for the most educated populations, that tends to be true. I don't know that that tends to be generally true. So much of it becomes a matter of spin. You can take the same set of data, and it so depends on how it's spun, and that really narrates what's going on. I mean, when I look at H1N1 going forward, I'm very thankful that right now the media are being relatively sane and responsible about all of this, and dealing with it as an accurate portrayal. But I admit that I don't trust them going forward. I think the CDC is doing a really good job of putting information out there in a very clear and consistent message. Again, I don't trust the media not to decide they want to spin it, because there's nothing like spinning fear to sell papers. And right now, guess what? Newspapers need to start selling papers. There's nothing like fear to spin a story and to get people to buy in. It's amazing how many requests that I get even to speak to basically pump up the fear within schools and folks. And there's a lot of money to be made in fear. I had the unfortunate experience of dealing with the attorneys general for a year and a half, and boy, is there an amazing amount of money in vendors and other such folks to be made off of constant and perpetual fear mongering. So long as there is money to be made off of fear, I'm not convinced that data can actually combat it, although I wish that was true.
We can get one more question here. Go ahead.
Topic now, it sounds like my question is twofold. Okay, is these fear culture just new? It'll just come in with the Twitter, Facebook thing? And second, it sounds like you're saying it's growing. Well, part of the first question is, what percentage out there do you feel for anything of that? Have this kind of feeling? I hope not everybody. And second of all, are you saying it's growing as a result?
So the fear of a lot of social media, the numbers have been going up, and different Pew that's been tracking it, Larry Rosen's been tracking it. Parent fear has been increasing. It's kind of stabilized around MySpace and Facebook. There's nothing like parents getting involved to do that. As far as fear has been going, fear has been cyclical and consistent for a very, very long time. There's some amazing literature on moral panics and different kinds of moral panics and the history of them. Many of the moral panics boil down to women's sexuality and youth, right? These are the two populations that we love to have moral panics around. And immigrants or any difference or other. One of my favorite of the moral panics literature, which we got to laugh at today, which is why it's a fun, laughable joke, was that for many years we were afraid of the sewing machine, because it would mean that women would rub their legs up and down all day, and this would definitely stimulate them in ways that would be really problematic, right? Okay, that's really fascinating. We had fears around comics. The fears around the internet are cyclical. They keep going on. They parallel our fears with youth around public spaces more generally. The 1980s literature on public spaces, like Jill Valentine's work on youth culture and public space, really documents how fear was used systematically to get young people out of the public space. Right? And it was really interesting. One of the ways you see it in the U.S. is through curfew laws. Curfew laws, while first implemented in the 1940s to keep different racial minorities out of the public life at certain hours, were re-implemented starting in the late 60s and early 70s in urban environments as an attempt to curb what they called youth gangs, which, mind you, look nothing like what we're talking about today. At some point in the 80s, a bunch of researchers went and actually started doing the research and said, wow, is there any correlation? Has the introduction of curfew laws actually reduced violence among youth at all? And the answer was no, not at all. And when this data was reported back, the mayor of New Orleans was interviewed about this, and he said, it doesn't matter, our public spaces are better without them. Right? It's like, okay. So we keep coming back to these same systems, online and offline. So the online is a continuation of that. Predators come back every time we talk about publics. Whenever we talk about young people and access to public life, strangers are turned into predators. So we're seeing this manifestation going on, and that's one of the questions online of like, how do we start curbing this? I sat and mapped with a bunch of different researchers all of the data on this, and it goes back to data transparency questions, all of the data on this. And I can't get, Congress people or attorneys general to pay attention to it, because as far as they're concerned, these young people don't vote. Their parents do.
right? And that's where it's like, frustrating. The data is pretty consistent that the myths we have are not real. But again, we keep coming back to these things. So this cycle will continue. We will see new incarnations of it. If there's any new genre of technology, there will be fear wrapped around it. I promise you, given what I'm seeing with teenagers on Twitter, Twitter is going to be a site of fear mongering in about a year, and it's not going to be pretty. And this is frustrating because we see so much potential, and then it gets very much narrated by fear as a response to it.
Thank you, Danah. I'm going to give all of the panelists a chance to close with a prediction. I think you've led into this very nicely. So when today's teenagers have teenagers, what will they be telling them not to do with technology? Libby, you want to start us off? We're going for the quick one-liner here because we're trying to close.
What will they be telling them not to do?
That's right. Twitter in the future will have only 40 characters, not 160.
I think that we're probably going to be, I think we're going to continue to be telling teenagers to stay out of public space. I don't think the message is actually going to change.
Okay, it'll be the same. Ed?
I think that whatever social network software they're using, we're going to be reminding teenagers not to use it while they're driving.
Danah?
I'm really looking forward to the new rhyming stranger danger incarnations, right? Because we are going to be afraid of strangers forever, and particularly strangers that we don't, as adults, don't understand. Yeah.
But it'll be, whatever it is, it'll be in rhyme. Okay.
You keep your wireless PicoNet out of that boy's wireless PicoNet. You don't know where he's been.
Very good.
ASB, you get the last word.
No, I was going to say, not to confuse virtual reality with augmented reality.
Very good. And now, there are refreshments outside, and I promise you that they're perfectly safe.